It's great to see everyone. Guys, this is Chris Dixon, the father of mental models for Web3.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, A16Z actually just released a really exciting report today. I believe it's live. It's called The State of Crypto.
Yeah.
And that is also the title of this panel, because I think we want to go through sort of a state of the union. Here we are in May 2022.
Yep.
We're 10 years plus into this experiment. A little bit, I would say, earlier on the Web3 experiment. But could you start us off with this? So when you define Web3, and that I think is the theme for this conference, where we talk about the metaverse, we talk about crypto, we talk about NFTs, Web3 really encapsulates all of these things. Define it for us. What's your mental model for Web3?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to kind of frame it is Web 1 is read, Web 2, can you hear me? Is it an echo? Okay, sorry. Web 2 is read write, and Web 3 is read write own, which is what we show on the slide. Another way to think of it, like very briefly, I've written a lot more about this too if folks are interested, and on my Twitter account and other places, but Web 1 is roughly 1990-ish, I think, when kind of the modern web started, to around 2005. And there were a lot of great things in that era, but it was sort of characterized by wide distribution of knowledge. So kind of, I think of the killer app of that era was you go to Google, you type a phrase, and anyone in the world can do that and go read something. And that was amazing. And then Web 2 came along, and you had things like Facebook and Twitter, where anyone in the world could, instead of just reading information, could also publish. So you could go and you could type into a Facebook text box, and suddenly the whole world would see it. And that was a really powerful thing. And we've seen that play out over 15 years, and obviously, Instagram and TikTok and just sort of social media in general has become really kind of had a profound influence. But the problem, and Web 2 was wonderful, and people got free services. We have something on the order of 5 billion people now with mobile phones, with relatively inexpensive services that are incredibly powerful. And those companies, I believe, contributed a lot to the world. But there was one big problem, which is they were very kind of concentrated power. So there's about 4 or 5 companies now that basically kind of control the internet. And I think we're at risk of having an internet that's kind of like the 1970s broadcast TV or something, where you have like CBS, NBC, a lot of sort of historical forms of media kind of consolidated at some point. I think we're at risk of that. I think what's nice is the internet is a much more kind of plastic medium. People like in this room, who I think will be the ones who do it, can go and change the internet. It's not over yet. We're very early in this process. And so we're very excited what we call Web 3. And the key feature with Web 3 is you now are sort of, instead of just democratizing knowledge and publishing, you're now democratizing ownership. And specifically, the way you can own something is through a token, whether it be fungible or non-fungible NFTs. I think of in the same way that sort of the magical first experience where you kind of get this in Web 1 was, I think, when you go to Google and type a word. I think in Web 3 you have things like airdrops as an example. So for those who remember the Uniswap airdrop, which I thought was a really interesting moment, you had this service that was popular and had a lot of users, but they were used to kind of peering over the fence at Web 2 companies and not being part of it. And then that day of the airdrop, 15% of the ownership of the protocol was given out to all of the users according to how much they'd used it, right? And we're seeing more and more of that happening. I think it's become the norm now in Web 3 is about at least half of your ownership of your project, your tokens, are given to the community based on their actions, right? That's very, very different, where essentially you're giving 0 in Web 2, both in terms of ownership and in terms of just revenue economics and things, which we'll kind of get to some of these slides. So I believe we're in the kind of beginning of this Web 2 era. I think it started roughly a few years ago when a lot of the blockchains and other kinds of technologies we're talking about at this conference got to a point of like kind of minimum viable maturity. And I think we're going to have a really exciting decade, and this is how I spend all of my time, and we have a whole team devoted to it. And I think this is the future and the most exciting thing to be working on in the technology world right now.
So Chris, what you're saying is we've really unlocked an entirely new, I guess, primitive here. So from read to read write, where we got the social media era, to read write and own.
That's right.
And that just doesn't unlock opportunity for investors and people in the audience. That also unlocks massive opportunity for creators. And we've seen recently in the last year or two the rise of this NFT economy. What's been so exciting, I think, is that is not a bunch of finance geeks kind of geeking out on things. These are like musicians. These are artists. These are creators with communities. Can you talk about that? I know your State of Crypto report covers that a little bit. What are you seeing in the NFT space, and how does that relate to the Web3 vision?
Yeah, I think NFTs are particularly important because they have this kind of cultural media aspect, attached to them, and they're less sort of DeFi, we're very active in DeFi and very excited about DeFi, but it's much more of a quantitative kind of experience, whereas NFTs have this kind of media and kind of cultural aspect, which I think really kind of catalyzed a movement of sort of a new cohort of people into the space, and specifically creative people. And so with this slide, this is from our report today. What this slide highlights is that this is just, so that 3.9 billion is the amount. What we tried to estimate is not secondary sales and all sorts of total volume on something like OpenSea is dramatically higher than that. This is the subset of volume where the actual payouts went to creative people. And I think what's important here is I guess a couple of things. One is, although we're early in Web3, it's still, those are meaningful numbers, number one. And number two, I think it also highlights how poorly Web2 pays out. I mean, YouTube is really the best one, and they brag about this, 15 billion. That's a drop in the bucket on the internet. That's tiny. That's the total amount they pay out. Facebook pays out nothing. Twitter pays out nothing. They don't share revenue. So, you talk to a creative person who like built an audience on Twitter, and Facebook runs ads and makes whatever $100 billion plus dollars, and none of that money goes to those creators. And in fact, they even go beyond that. They have this whole teams of people whose job it is to reduce your organic reach, such that you have to go buy ads, and there's a whole kind of game they play to kind of suck all the money out of the creators. And I think what happened is, the creators just, I feel like there's this whole kind of generation who, people were seduced. These were incredible services. You could now have audiences. But I think it was a kind of a misleading pitch that these companies made, which is, hey, go build a career on this. And you have a lot of people who are disillusioned. And so one of the big opportunities we have, like with NFTs, is to bypass those platforms. So let's take music as an example. So music, Spotify advertises the fact that they have 8 million artists on Spotify, and 14,000 make 50,000 a year or more, and the rest make less. And so that means 14,000 make roughly like the average salary, and that's before cost and everything else. It's basically, music on the internet, it basically only works if you're an incredibly popular musician. Doesn't work for the long tail, for normal people who want to go and be creative and build an audience and everything else. So a lot of those musicians, at least in a non-COVID time, would make their money offline through merchandise, through touring. Why'd they do that? Because it's like NFTs, and that's the one place where they can bypass the platform and go direct to their fans. And so what NFTs do for those musicians, and we have some investments here like Sound XYZ and Royal, and there's a bunch of other exciting startups in the space, is they allow musicians to go and build experiences, digital collectibles, access passes, whatever they might be. NFTs are a very general kind of new computing primitive. You can impute any kind of whatever you want into it. You can have, it's a container. And so we're seeing all sorts of interesting experiments as to what those NFTs do. But the key thing is they can go directly to their audience, right? And so maybe they pay, OpenSea charges 2.5%. Some of these other platforms charge very, like everything you see in this space is a very low take rate. And it's not because OpenSea is altruistic, right? It's because you can switch, because the NFT doesn't exist on OpenSea. The NFT exists on the Ethereum blockchain or on some other blockchain, and or Solana blockchain, whatever it might be, and you can switch. And so there's a much more competitive market where these services have to actually earn their take rates. They have to earn the economics they take, instead of just being granted them, frankly, which is what Web2 is, because of their monopolistic network effects. Like I'm on Twitter, I have a bunch of Twitter followers. I would love to leave Twitter. I can't leave Twitter because I'm locked in, right? Because I've spent so many years. I can leave Twitter, but I would lose, years of work. And so one of the great things about these kind of blockchain architectures is they shift the power back to users. The users can switch. The creative people can switch. They can bypass the platforms. So I love this slide because I think it shows that as much as we are early in this movement, it's already meaningful. In fact, I'd like to turn this into a dashboard that kind of tracks in real time.
Wow.
In the same way like DeFi Pulse tracks TVL. I'd love to start tracking the Web3 creative economy. See if we have to go build that, but if someone else wants to build that, would be awesome. But I think it'd be really interesting to track. I'm hoping that we can pass Web2 in the next year or two.
Guys, that's code for Chris Dixon wants some builder in the audience to come build this dashboard.
I just think it'd be a cool thing. It'd be fun to track. You know how when people create like DeFi Pulse, they create dashboards.
Absolutely.
It creates a mimetic shelling point, as Kevin said. So.
What's super cool about this is it's already here. I saw the Chainsmokers, it was just last week, issued 5,000 NFTs for their new album using the Royal platform. Yeah. So this is all here. I think one interesting thing, and this was also surfaced in your report as well, and it goes back to the last panel. So if we're talking about read to read write to own in Web3, we need to talk about the thing, maybe call it a commodity. I don't know what exactly to call this thing that secures all of that ownership. And that thing is Blockspace. And Chris, I remember a podcast that we did back last year, the end of last year, and you said something that stuck with me. It's, I'm very bullish Blockspace this decade. That's what you said. Why are you bullish Blockspace, and how are you seeing that evolve across multiple chains, across Ethereum, across layer 2s?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I kind of I'll try to keep this within 20 minutes or whatever we have. But I kind of think about the history of computing as the history of these sort of every 10 to 15 years you have a major computing wave from World War II. You had mainframe computers, mini computers, PCs, internet, mobile phones, and in each wave you had kind of key new resources. So like with the internet, it was broadband, right? And with PCs, obviously, it was like CPU, and you see it in the ads, like Intel Inside, 2.x gigahertz, et cetera. Like that's the thing, right? Now we're in an era where people are building, developers are building on top of blockchains, and they're inventing all these cool new things you can do. But one of the scarce resources, as people know who've used these systems, is the block space itself. Meaning, on Ethereum L1, that's reflected in high gas fees. On in other blockchains, it's reflected in other ways. And so, of course, one of the key questions is can we build enough of the infrastructure to allow the application developers to go and the musicians we were just talking about to go and do these things in a way that's accessible to their fans, right? And that have just good properties, you settle a transaction quickly, the gas fees are reasonable, the transactions succeed, it's highly secure, et cetera. So anyway, so one of the neat things that we've seen, I think, in the last couple of years is we've seen a lot of innovation at the both L1 and L2 layer, and we'll have a few slides after this, which kind of help highlight this. Well, so yeah, this slide and the previous slide, so we can't show them together. The previous slide shows that there's a diversity of blockchains, specifically things like Solana and Polygon, which have much lower gas fees and have, I think, in my job talking to application developers every day, I think they feel really excited that there's more choices now and that there's more kind of credible choices. And you can see from some of the numbers that this has increased the kind of accessible the user base as you might expect. At the same time, I want to make sure, since I'm sure there's a lot of Ethereum fans here, that that Ethereum is still I think this is probably the best metric for measuring this. This is just total money spent per day, which is a reflection of demand. Ethereum is still far ahead on that. I think we're at a point. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Like the other really exciting thing happening right now are L2s, which maybe we could dive into more. But although it felt like we've been on the cusp of real L2s for a while, I think we genuinely are now, and I think in the next 6 to 12 months, beyond, we already have, of course, Optimism, Arbitrum, ZK Sync, Starkware, et cetera, but I think there's going to be a whole bunch of features that roll out that make them kind of more production ready, mainstream ready.
And you're confident, Chris, that we're going to fill all of this block space supply that's coming? Like, will there be enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, if you look at, so it's a very interesting question. I remember very vividly, it was like 2003 when I was doing my first startup, internet startup, and there were all of these debates, like in the same way that there's debates now around blockchains, there were this debates around broadband, believe it or not. For people that were not there, it's amazing. There were literally
people were not bullish broadband.
No. In fact, it was widely known that we overbuilt bandwidth. If you go back and look at it, all these dark fiber articles, it's overbuilt. The dot-com crash, if you go look back at the numbers, it was actually much more around telecom than it was. I mean, a lot of internet startups did bad too, but I think the amount of value loss was something like 90% was telecom. Specifically because the market said, basically, wait, we way overestimated the demand for these things. And you have to remember, 2003, most people, I always like to cite like a TV show like Friends, go back and watch TV and movies from 2003. The internet doesn't exist. Maybe occasionally they go online, they go to the corner, beep, 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 they do this thing, they go check their email. And so basically you ask people like 2003, do you want broadband? And they were like, well, my email works pretty well, I guess it could be faster, right? There wasn't Netflix, there wasn't YouTube, there weren't all these other things. But what happens is as these, and this is throughout the history of computing, is as these new resources get built out, developers, people in this room who are much more creative and smarter than I am, come up with great new ideas, right? And and how do we use these services? Economists call this induced demand. It's the effect of when, in many cases, when you build more highway lanes, you actually end up with more traffic. Why is that? Because people are creative and entrepreneurial, and they build stores and houses and communities and whatever it might be, right? And the highway developer doesn't think of those things. Like I'm like the highway developer, like I'm not going to think of those things, but I know they're going to come. And what's going to happen is the same kind of reinforcing feedback loop is going to happen between blockchain infrastructure and applications that happened in the 2010s between mobile phones and applications. I mean, look at your mobile phone. Like, I actually have my original iPhone from like 2008. I mean, it was like tiny little postage stamp. It wasn't as good in many ways. But really, the big thing that's changed, I mean, it's gotten a lot better. I want to dismiss that, the performance, the camera, everything else. But the big thing that's different are the apps, right? I mean, it's also like, all I had was like 3 apps back then. I mean, well, both are important, right? The infrastructure got better and the apps got better. But those two things reinforced each other. Because entrepreneurs came along and invented, Snapchat and Uber and Venmo and all these things, Apple sold more phones, had more money to invest in chips and cameras, and it's this flywheel that happens, right? It happened before that with Intel and Microsoft and Dell and Intuit in the PC era. It happened in the internet era. And so what those the cynics in 2003, and this has happened over and over. By the way, this is the history of working on the internet. It's the history of having everybody say what you're doing is a toy, it's a bubble, it's fake. It's just over and over. Like my partner Mark Andreessen and I joke about it. We just hear literally this. I tell you how many times. There was a decade when social media was a joke, and then suddenly it flips a switch, and it's like, oh my God, it's so important that we have to we have geopolitics as to govern, there's never an intermediate phase where it's like pretty important or something. It's always like, it's a joke, you're a fraud. Oh my God, it's so important it needs to be nationalized or something. I guarantee you, 10 years from now, it'll be like, okay, why do we need to nationalize this optimism? It's so important anyway. But right now it's a joke. Anyway, so it's the same pattern over and over. And right now we're in the phase. I believe very strongly we're in this phase where we're kind of, there's a lot of excitement. It's great to see all these people here. A lot of great ideas. The infrastructure, it's kind of like the airplane is shaking and spewing out some steam. It's not perfect, but it's flying. And then we're trying to fix it or developers are trying to fix it in the air. But I am very optimistic on the infrastructure side and the application side. The other thing I'll mention is, our firm, I run our crypto group. We have a whole bunch of other verticals who invest in other areas. We've seen just a complete transformation in the entrepreneurial interest level of Web3 to the point of, I would say, and this is not just our firm, this is across sort of tech, probably something like well over half of all startups are now, throughout the whole tech industry from the investor point of view. Like my friends who do angel investing who are kind of agnostic with respect to sector, more than half are Web3. So there is a lot of really good stuff coming. So in this report, I tweeted out today, for those interested, what we're trying to show is look, we may be entering a winter now. Actually, do we have the slides with the
yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Okay. So just to go back to what you were saying, Chris, is there's another mental model to unlock. What is Blockspace? It's ownership bandwidth. Not being long Blockspace is not not being long bandwidth in the late 1990s. But I want to maybe end and conclude with this question, because this is top of mind. We had a rough week last week. Yep. And in some ways, from a pricing perspective, not from a talent inflow perspective, but from a price perspective, crypto is kind of down bad. We're down bad on the year. And so inevitably, we're going to start to see, is this the end of crypto? Are NFTs over? Are all of these chains over? What are you seeing? Because this is a pattern that you seem to have identified. There's some numbers in the report. Tell us about this. Should we be worried?
Yeah, I mean, look. So first of all, I don't want to minimize when startups fail, people lose jobs. These things are never these kinds of volatile periods are never pleasant. I think zooming out and looking at the big picture, I've been in the space since formally at least 2013. I led our investment in Coinbase and have been through now, I guess, three of the downturns. 2014, 15 was pretty brutal. 18, 19 was really brutal, and we may be entering another one. I think that with this slide, what we're trying to show. So my mental model has always been kind of what happens is that when prices go up, that generates a lot more interest. So your roommate thinks it's interesting to go check out and reads the Ethereum white paper. The press starts talking about crypto more, whatever it might be, and that kind of crypto pills a bunch more people. And then some of those people then decide they want to build something. And that might be an open source project, or it might be a startup. And then, startup, generally those things take a couple of years, to build something, especially 2015 era, because most people were building blockchains, layer ones, infrastructure, which is those are complex. And then eventually those, those seeds are planted and then they kind of blossom a few years later. That was always my kind of theory. And with this project here, my colleague Eddie Lazarin, who's a data scientist, I said to Eddie at one point a couple of years ago, I was like, this is my theory, but let's go see if it's true. And so he went and for each of these things did a very rigorous data analysis. So for developer activity, we went through all these various GitHub repos and looked at all the pull requests and things like that. Startup activity, this is PitchBook data. Social media activity, this was like Reddit, Discord, Twitter. And you can't see it in the slide, but what's interesting is if you zoom into each era, it almost looks like each era looks very eerily similar. But basically, if you look at the ordering, you do see sort of this causal linkage between, first you see prices go up, and then you see social media activity, and then you see developer activity, et cetera. And so I really believe this is kind of the kind of patterns that we see. And what that yields is, although it's very chaotic per quarter, you said we had a bad week, maybe a bad year, but if you zoom out and you say, is this going to be a bad 3 years? So far, if this pattern continues, and I believe it will, it's actually a much more kind of orderly kind of growth and progression than it would feel like when you're inside of it. I realize it doesn't always feel that way. And I would say specifically now, like the number of seeds planted, like this is what we do in our day job. People come to us, we invest in them. We have there's a lot of other firms who do it. Like, it's just, there's a lot of great people building a lot of great things. And the other thing that makes me excited is that the infrastructure stuff just inherently takes longer. It takes years to build out like an L1, a Solana, something like this. Like now, a lot of the stuff people are building are they're much shorter cycle times. They're games, media experiences, NFT projects, et cetera, that might take, you fund them and they might take 6 to 12 months to launch and not 3 years to launch. So I think the cadence is increasing, and I think that the kind of quality of the developer is increasing, the infrastructure is maturing. So I would just say, not to minimize the bad stuff going on, but I do think if you step back and look at the broader trends, I think there's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic.
Amazing. So, Chris, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. I guess just in 30 seconds, if you could just give us final thoughts on the state of crypto right now in Web3.
Yeah. Gosh. So, what else would I say? I would say, I don't know. I just think it's a really exciting time. I get asked sometimes, like, why am I so fired up and flying to Florida and doing all these conferences and everything else? And I think for me, I think there's just if you look at the computing cycles I mentioned, these are sort of 15-year cycles typically, and I believe in those cycles there's like 1 to 2 year kind of golden periods. Go look at all the top apps on your iPhone, and I think all of them were 2009 to 11-ish, where the companies were started. That was the mobile golden period, because iPhone came out in 2007, App Store 2008. It takes people a year or two to kind of figure out how to build on these things. Then there's a sort of this influx of really talented people. They build the golden things. And then there's still stuff that's cool that came later, but it was much more kind of derivative, because the core things. So I believe we are in that golden period now in Web3. I do believe that. I think this is the time. I think the infrastructure's there. The talent is here. I think this would be a very special time. You don't get that many of these kind of times in your career. I believe we're in that. That's what I'm fired up about. That's what gets me, up in the morning. And so, anyways, I think it's a really great time, and it's awesome to see all these people and all the energy here.
Guys, you're at the right place. We are in the golden era, entering the golden era of Web3. Chris Dixon, give it up for Chris Dixon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Absolutely.